There is one mystery that more perhaps than any other keeps ethical philosophers sleepless, awake at night. It is the mystery called in Latin unde malum, very old question, 2000 years old. Unde malum means whence the evil, where from evil comes. But more specifically and yet more urgently, there is another question. How come that good people turn evil? Caring family people, friendly, benevolent neighbors, turn suddenly into monsters. The acute interest in these two questions, closely related questions, was triggered by the rising tide of 20th century totalitarianism, but it was set in feverish motion by the discovery of Holocaust, and particularly accelerated yet further by the growing evidence that after the awesome shock of the Holocaust, the world did not become safer than it used to be, as it was expected, and that the world after the Holocaust is more and more reminiscent to a minefield. By a minefield, what is characteristic of a minefield is that one knows that an explosion must sooner or later occur, but no one can tell you when and where. Well, let me start from one case. Slavenka Drakulic, Croat journalist and essayist, has documented the lives and deeds of war criminals brought to the Hague Tribunal in the aftermath of the civil war that tore apart the country known for 70 years under the name of Yugoslavia. Results of her unique first-hand, face-to-face investigation she collected in a remarkable book titled They Wouldn't Hurt a Fly. One of the reports contains a reflection on one of the tribunal first trials conducted against Dragoljub Kunarac, Radomir Kovac and Zoran Vukovic, a driver, a waiter and a shop assistant. Rank and file 3 Bosnian Serbs from a little town of Foča. Drakulic, the author of the book, the witness, reports the impressions. Were you to meet any one of them before the war, she says, it wouldn't have occurred to you that they were particularly brutal. Just 3 ordinary guys of the kind you meet daily. But there was a war, and you know now that all 3 were capable of torture, kidnapping, rape, and murder in cold blood. How that is possible? One seeks in vain some evident sign of perversion that would allow you to spot the murderous potential, signal that there is a danger in these 3 people. In vain, however, in vain, you wouldn't find them. There must be great multitude of similar cases like those 3, since during that war, Yugoslav war, post-Yugoslav war, 60,000 women were raped and 200,000 people were murdered. Another defendant facing the tribunal, Goran Jerisic, sentenced to 40 years of prison for murdering men and women arrested at the police precinct he commanded. Looks like a person you can trust. A man like him, so Drakulic observes, helps usually old people across the street, stands up in a tram to offer his seat to an invalid, lets others to move forward in the supermarket queue if they have no time to wait. He would return a wallet to his rightful owner if he found it. Best friend, trustworthy neighbor, ideal son-in-law. Seriously, you wouldn't find in his pre-war life a slightest hint of pathology. He was a quiet, in fact, a rather timid boy, not a pushing one, self-effacing, known to be eager to help all others around him. Well, beginning from 7th May 1992, the day he shot his first victim, and for 18 consecutive days, the 23-year-old Goran Jerisic reincarnated into a sadistic beast. Survivors among his prisoners remember him walking and shouting as if in a trance, as if dragged, as if taking leave of his senses. His gaze froze his victims before his gun murdered them. He picked his victims at random, so he was not choosy. He picked an old man for dropping a bottle on the floor and a young Croat man for marrying a Serbian girl. He ordered them to kneel, lower their heads over a sewage grill, and put his gun to their necks. Sometimes he invited Monica, his girlfriend, to watch and admire his efficiency. All that, day in, day out, for 18 days in succession. Why? What was the secret? Drakulic's son-in-law, also a Croat, was in many ways just a nice young man like Jerisic. Like Jerisic, addicted to fishing, his favorite pastime. Unlike Jerisic, he volunteered to join the newly formed Croat police. That Jerisic did, and Drakulic's son-in-law went to Canada before the Civil War started. An accident? Asked Drakulic. Could it all happen the other way around? She desperately trying to crack the mystery, but she doesn't have an answer to her own question. She asks, could my son-in-law volunteer to the Croat police? And she continues, it was for the first time in his life that Goran Jerisic, having volunteered to the Croat police, had power. He was given a gun and told to use it freely. I still think, she concludes, that even if he turned indeed into an oppressor, in a deeper sense he was a victim. He and all his generation were deceived. They embraced the nationalist ideology and did nothing to stop the war that grew out of it. They were too opportunistic and too frightened for refusing to follow their commanders. And let me remind you that before 7th May 1992, no one who set his or her eyes on friendly, handsome young man called Goran Jerisic would, anyone who did it would swear that this man would not hurt a fly. Well, a study called The Lucifer Effect, written by Philip Zimbardo and published in 2007, is a blood-curdling and nerve-wracking investigation of a bunch of good, ordinary, likable and popular American lads and lasses who turned into monsters once they had been transported to a sort of a nowhere place, to the faraway country, exotic country of Iraq, and put in charge of prisoners suspected of evil intentions to commit crimes. Well, my dear friends, how safe and comfortable, cozy and friendly the world would feel if it were monsters and monsters alone who perpetrated monstrous deeds. Against monsters, we are relatively fairly well protected, and so we may rest quiet and we are insured against the evil deeds that monsters are capable of and threaten to perpetrate. We have psychologists to spot psychopaths and sociopaths. We have sociologists to tell us where they are likely to propagate and congregate. We have judges to condemn the monsters to confinement and isolation. And we have police, psychiatrists, to make sure that they stay there forever. Alas, the good, ordinary, likable American lads and lasses in Iraq were neither monsters nor perverts. Were they not assigned to lord over the inmates of the improvised prison of Abu Ghraib, we would never know, we would never surmise, guess, imagine, fantasize the horrifying things they were capable of contriving. It wouldn't occur to any of us that this smiling girl at the counter in a small American township might, once on overseas assignment, excel at devising ever more clever, fanciful, as well as wicked and perverse tricks to harass, molest, torture, and humiliate her wards. In her and her companions' hometowns, their neighbors, watching them from birth, refused to believe to this very day that those charming lads and lasses are the same folks as the monsters in the snapshot of the Abu Ghraib torture chambers. But they are the same. In the conclusion of his psychological study of Chip Frederick, the suspected leader and guide of the torture pack, Philip Zimbardo had to say that, I quote, "There is absolutely nothing in his record that I was able to uncover that would predict that Chip Frederick would engage in any form of abusive, sadistic behavior. On the contrary, there is much in his record to suggest that had he not been forced to work and live in such an abnormal situation, he might have been the military's all-American poster soldier on its recruitment ads. Indeed, Chip Frederick would have passed with flying colors any imaginable psychological test, as well as the most thorough scrutiny routinely applied in the selection of candidates for the most responsible and morally sensitive services, including the official uniform guardians of law and order. Well, in the case of Chip Frederick and his closest and most notorious companion, Lindy England, you might still insist, even if wrongly, counterfactually, that they had acted on command and had been forced to engage in atrocities they detested and abhorred. Meek sheep rather than predatory wolves. The sole charge against them would then be one of cowardice or exaggerated respect for their superiors. At the utmost, the charge of having too easily, without as much as a murmur of protest, abandoned the moral principles which guided them in their ordinary life at home. But what about those at the top of bureaucratic ladder? Those who gave the commands, who forced the obedience and punished the disobedient. Those people surely must have been monsters. The inquiry into the Abu Ghraib outrage never reached the top echelons of the American military command, for the top command issuing people to be brought to trial and tried for war crimes, they would first need to find themselves on the defeated side in the war they waged, which they did not. But Adolf Eichmann, presiding over the tools and procedure of the final solution of the Jewish problem, and giving orders to their operators, was on the side of the defeated, had been captured by victors, and had been brought to their courts. There was therefore an occasion to submit the monster hypothesis to a most careful, indeed meticulous study, and by the most distinguished members of the psychological and psychiatric professions hired for that purpose by the Israeli court. The final conclusions drawn from those supreme psychologists and psychiatrists' most thorough and reliable research was anything but ambiguous. Here it is, as conveyed in her famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, by Hannah Arendt. I quote, "Half a dozen psychiatrists had certified him as normal. More normal at any rate than I am after examining him," one of them was said to have exclaimed, while another had found that his whole psychological outlook, his attitude towards wife and children, mother and father, brothers, sisters, and friends, was not only normal, but most desirable. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more horrifying than all the atrocities put together. It must indeed have been most terrifying of findings. If not ogres, but normal people, I am tempted to add guys like you and me, commit atrocities and are capable of acting in a perverted and sadistic way, then all the thieves we have invented and put in place to strain out the carriers of inhumanity from the rest of human species are either botched in execution or misconceived from the start, and most certainly they are ineffective. And so we are, to cut a long story short, unprotected. One is tempted to say defenseless against our shared morbid capacities. Employing their ingenuity to the utmost and trying to, as hard as they could, to civilize human manners and the patterns of human togetherness, our ancestors, and also those of us who have followed their line of thought and action, are, so to speak, barking up a wrong tree. If Eichmann was normal, then no one is a priori exempt from suspicion. None of our dozenly normal friends and acquaintances, and neither are we ourselves. The likes of Chip Frederick or Adolf Eichmann walk in our streets in full view, queue like us at the same shop checkouts, fill cinemas, football grandstands, travel on trains and city buses, or stick next to us in the traffic jams. They might live next door or even sit at our dining table. All of them, given propitious circumstances, might do what Chip Frederick or Adolf Eichmann did. And what about me, myself? Since so many people can potentially commit acts of inhumanity, I might easily, by chance, by a mere caprice of fate, become one of their victims. They can do it. This is what I already know. But isn't it so that equally easily it may be I myself who become one of them, just another ordinary human who can do to other humans what they have done? Okay, you may say Eichmann was poisoned by inhuman ideology and brainwashed by a totalitarian state. But wait a moment. John Steiner used metaphorically the notion of a sleeper, drawn from the terminology of spy networks, to denote as yet undisclosed personal inclination to commit acts of violence, some odious potential that may be hypothetically present in particular individuals like you and me, while remaining for a long time, perhaps even forever, invisible. And an inclination that can surface in some circumstances, only under some particular circumstances. Presumably, once the forces that hitherto repressed it and kept under cover are abruptly weakened and removed. Erwin Staub moved one step further, deleting references to particularity in Steiner's proposition and hypothesizing the presence of malevolent sleepers in most, perhaps all humans. He says, I quote, "Evil committed by ordinary people is the norm, not an exception." Is he right? Well, I must admit that we don't know and we will never know, at least never know for sure, as there is no way to prove or disprove that guess empirically. Possibilities are not unlike chicken. They can be reliably counted only after they have been hatched, not before. So what do we know for sure? Well, let's start again from Zimbardo, who earlier conducted a series of experiments at Stanford University with the Ivy League, the crème de la crème students randomly selected to play the role of prison guards towards fellow students, also randomly cast in the role of prisoners. What Zimbardo found in his experiment, I quote, is the enormous, frightening ease with which sadistic behavior could be elicited in individuals who were most certainly not sadistic types. Or take another experiment of Stanley Milgram, conducted in another Ivy League university, Yale. Again with randomly chosen people who were asked to inflict on other humans a series of what they were made to believe were painful electrical shocks of escalating magnitude. What Stanley Milgram found was that obedience to authority, any authority, regardless of the nature of the commands that authority may give you, is a deeply ingrained behavior tendency. Even if the subjects find the action they are told to perform repugnant and revolting. If you add to that other factors, such as well-nigh universal consequences of socialization, such factors as attributes of loyalty, sense of duty, discipline. If you add all these factors, men are led to kill, says Stanley Milgram, with little difficulty. It is easy, in other words, to prod, to push, to seduce, to entice non-evil people to commit evil things. Christopher Browning investigated the twisted yet invariably gory itinerary of men belonging to the German Reserve Police Battalion 101, assigned to the police from among conscripts, randomly chosen conscripts, unfit for frontline duty, and therefore assigned to participate far away from the front line in the mass murder of Jews in Poland. Considerable majority of those people who had never been known to commit a single violent, let alone murderous act before, and gave no ground to suspicion of being capable of committing them, were ready to comply with the command to murder. To shoot point blank, men and women, old people, children, unarmed, obviously innocent, not charged with any crime, and not nestling the slightest intention to harm them or their comrades in arms. What Browning found, however, and published under the telling it all title Ordinary Men, was the following. About 10% of the conscripted policemen proved to be refusers, who asked to be excused from carrying out the orders, transferred to another kind of job. On the other hand, there were approximately the same minority of enthusiastic killers who volunteered for the firing squads and Jew hands, but by far the largest group of among the conscript policemen performed placidly, obediently, impassionately the role of murderers and ghetto cleaners when assigned to it, so not seeking opportunities to kill on their own initiative. The most striking aspect of that finding was, in my view, the amazing similarity between Browning's statistical distributions and that of the reactions to the authoritatively endorsed commands by the subjects of Zimbardo's and Milgram's experiments. In all three cases, some people who were ordered to commit cruelty were only too eager to jump to the occasion and give vent to their evil drives. Some also, roughly of the same number, and also a small minority, refused to do evil, whatever the circumstances and whatever the consequences of their abstention. Whereas an extensive middle ground was filled by people who were indifferent, lukewarm, and not particularly engaged or strongly committed to one or another side of the attitudinal spectrum, avoiding taking any stand, whether for morality or against it, and preferring instead to follow the line of least resistance and do whatever prudence dictated them and their unconcern allowed them to do. In other words, in all three cases, as well as in innumerable other on record, the probabilities that the command to do evil will be obeyed or resisted has followed the standard known in statistics as the Gaussian curve, sometimes called the Gaussian bell because of its shape, Gaussian distribution, or Gaussian function. A curve believed to be the graph of the most common prototypical, to wit normal, distribution of probabilities. What the notion of Gaussian curve refers to is the normal tendency of results to cluster around a mean or an average. By the central limit theorem, any variable that is the sum of a large number of independent factors is likely to be in such a way, in other words, normally distributed. As the probabilities of various behavioral responses by people exposed to the pressure to do evil show a clear tendency to take the form of a Gaussian curve, we can risk the supposition that in their case as well, the results were compounded by the mutual interference of a large number of independent factors. Commands descending from on high, instinctual or deeply entrenched respect or fear of authority, loyalty reinforced by the consideration of duty and by drill discipline were some of those different factors, but not necessarily the only ones. Our shared experience thus far offers few, if any, reasons to be optimistic. But there is something which compounds even further the darkness of premonition, and that is the knowledge that Winfried George Sebold, in his 1999 study Luftkrieg and Literatur, published in the English translation under the title On the Natural History of Destruction, suggests that we are unable to learn from the misfortunes we bring on ourselves. We are incorrigible and will continue along the beaten tracks that bear some slight relation to the old road network. Bent as we all are by nature of training on seeking and finding the shortest way to the aims we pursue and believe to be worth pursuing, misfortunes, and particularly misfortunes suffered by others, do not seem to us an excessively high price to pay for shortening the way, cutting the cost, cutting the corners, and magnifying the effects. We don't learn. In a seminal, yet for decades overlooked or neglected study of the Nagasaki syndrome phenomenon, Günther Anders, the great German philosopher, or rather Austrian philosopher, suggested that what has been done once can be repeated over again, with ever weaker and weaker reservations. With each successive case, more and more matter-of-factly, casually, with little deliberation or motive. He concludes, repetition of outrage is not just possible, but probable, as the chance to win the battle for its prevention gets smaller, while that of losing it rises unstoppably. Just one example. On 16 March 1945, when Nazi Germany was already on its knees and the speedy end of war was no longer in doubt, Arthur Bomber Harris, the chief commander of the bombardment of Germany in England, sent 225 Lancaster bombers and 11 Mosquito fighter planes, ordered to discharge 289 tons of explosive and 573 tons of incendiary substances on Würzburg, a middle-sized town in Germany of 107,000 residents, rich in history and abundantly blessed with art treasure, but poor in industry, and therefore presenting no strategically important target. Between the 9:20 and 9:37 p.m., about 5,000 inhabitants of Würzburg, of whom 66% were women and 14% were children, were killed, whereas 21,000 living houses were set on fire. Only 6,000 residents of Würzburg found a roof over their heads once the British planes left. Hermann Knell, who calculated above figures following a scrupulous scrutiny of archives, asks why a town devoid of all and any strategic significance has been selected for destruction. Having examined and disqualified one by one all conceivable alternative causes, Knell was left with the one and only sensible answer to his question. His answer was Arthur Harris and Karl Spaatz, for a change the commander of the US Air Force in Great Britain and Italy, found themselves at the beginning of 1945 short of targets. I quote from Hermann Knell: "The bombing progressed as planned without consideration of the changed military situation. The destruction of German cities continued until the end of April. Seemingly, once the military machine was moving, it couldn't be stopped. It had a life of its own. There was now all the equipment and there were soldiers on hand. It must have been that aspect that made Harris decide to have Würzburg attacked." But why Würzburg in the first place? Purely for reason of convenience. As previous reconnaissance sorties have shown, the city could be easily located with the electronic aids available at that time. And the city was sufficiently distanced from the advancing troops, Allied troops, to reduce the threat of another so-called friendly fire, namely dropping the bombs on their own troops. In other words, the town was an easy and riskless target. This was Würzburg's inadvertent and unwitting fault, a kind of fault for which no target would ever be pardoned once the military machine was moving. Günther Anders, I return to him now, asks, are we, in this age of machines, the last relics of the past who did not manage as yet to clean off the toxic residues of past atrocities? And he answers, the outrage under discussion were committed then not because they were still feasible or as yet failed to be eradicated, but on the contrary, they were perpetrated already then, because already then they became feasible and plausible. Let me sum up. There must have been the first moment in which the technologically assisted atrocities, until then inconceivable, had become feasible. Those atrocities must have had their moment of beginning, their starting point, but it does not follow that they must have an end as well. It doesn't follow that they entered human cohabitation on a brief visit only, and even less does it follow that they brought or set in motion some mechanisms bound to cause sooner or later their departure. It is rather the other way around. Once the contraption allowing to separate technological capacity from moral scruples and moral imagination is put in place, it becomes self-propelling, self-reinforcing, and self-reinvigorating. Atrocities, in other words, do not self-condemn or self-destruct. On the contrary, they tend to self-reproduce and self-intensify. What was once an unexpectedly horrifying turn of fate and a shock, awesome discovery, gruesome revelation, degenerates slowly into a routine, conditioned reflex. Hiroshima was a shock with deafeningly loud and seemingly non-extinguishable echoes. But 3 days later, Nagasaki was hardly a shock, evoking few, if any, echoes. By now, it is half forgotten. Joseph Roth, the great Austrian writer, pointed to one of the mechanisms of this desensitizing habituation. I quote, "When a catastrophe occurs, people at hand are shocked into helpfulness. Certainly, acute catastrophes have that effect. It seems that people expect catastrophes to be brief. Chronic catastrophes are so unpalatable to neighbors that they gradually become indifferent to them and to their victims, if not downright impatient." Roth says gradually. Between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 3 days proved enough to insensitize. In other words, catastrophe blazes the trail of its own continuation. By consigning the initial shock and outrage to oblivion, and therefore emaciating and enfeebling human solidarity with its victims, and so sapping the possibility of joining forces for the sake of staving off the future victimage. Well, it all sounds, unfortunately, I am very sorry for that, rather pessimistic. But let me remind you what Günther Anders, already mentioned twice, said in response to a journalistic suggestion that he belongs in the ranks of panic mongers. Well, he replied that he considers the panic monger title to be a sign of distinction, to be worn with pride, adding that in our days the most important moral task is to make people aware that they need to be alarmed, and that the fears that haunt them have valid reasons.